Before John Brown's Harper's Ferry raid, the prospect of Southern secession from the Union still seemed remote. Afterward, it suddenly became much more real. Some white Southerners had been talking for decades about secession, but it seemed almost otherworldly until the Harper's Ferry raid, and the reaction that sprang from that really shifted the landscape. How had it come to pass that this one man and 18 followers could have had such an impact on American society? It was not because of the raid's intrinsic importance. After all, not a single solitary slave had been liberated by Brown, and almost all the fatalities were among Brown's own men. And ironically, one of the few dead among the Virginians was Hayward Shepherd, a free black man who worked as a railroad watchman. The federal presidential administration had promptly sent in the Marines. No, the raid mattered more because it touched upon several of the nation's most divisive issues: slavery, abolitionism, religion, and sectionalism. It also pointed to the important role played by perception. Sometimes it matters less what has actually happened than what people think has happened. And sometimes the overt action matters less than the covert motivation ascribed to it. By the end of the 1850s, the politics of mutual suspicion and hatred had destroyed almost every institution that bound the North and South together. Most Protestant denominations, for example, had split over the issue of slavery. The Whig Party had disappeared altogether, with many of its adherents, including Abraham Lincoln, joining the new Republican Party, created in 1854 primarily to oppose the expansion of slavery into federal territories. Now, the Republican Party was entirely sectional, its members confined entirely to the North. South of the Mason-Dixon line, the party did not even exist. And in the 1860 presidential election, Republican nominee Abraham Lincoln was not even on the ballot in most slaveholding states. The sole remaining national institution was the Democratic Party, which until 1860 was functioning just fine in both the North and the South. But in the early months of the 1860 campaign season, the Democratic Party split, with most Southern Democrats refusing to accept Senator Stephen A. Douglas as the party's nominee because his support for the extension of slavery into the territories was less than total. And so when their effort to block Douglas's nomination at the first Democratic convention failed, these Southern Democrats walked out of the convention hall, one after another, star after star, as one reporter said. And they went to Baltimore. They convened another convention and nominated John C. Breckinridge, who was then President James Buchanan's vice president, who ran as a Southern Democrat. And amid this fracturing of American politics, all alarmed Southern moderates formed the Constitutional Union Party, whose only platform was, let's preserve the Union. And so the national presidential contest in the autumn of 1860 was really two contests. In the North, it was one between Douglas, that had been, he'd been placed in nomination by sort of the major wing of the Democratic Party, and he squared off with the Republican nominee Abraham Lincoln. In the South, it was a contest between Southern Democrat John C. Breckinridge and John Bell, who was the Constitutional Union Party's nominee. We think of the American democratic experience as a great success. Yet the Civil War confronts us with the brutal truth that our democracy has not always succeeded. At one point, it broke. And it broke because Americans simply refused to abide by the result of an election whose integrity no one doubts. That is to say, no one has ever leveled charges that the outcome was decided by voter fraud, and whose result no one has ever doubted. Nobody thinks that Stephen Douglas, for example, actually won the election of 1860, much less John Breckinridge or John Bell. In the election, Lincoln won only 40% of the popular vote, just 40%, but 59% of the electoral college vote. That is to say, of course, more electoral college votes than all the other competitors combined. And Southern radical politicians, they called themselves fire eaters, argued that the slaveholding South was in imminent danger of being subjugated by this new tyrannical Black Republican majority unless Southern states left the Union and formed a government of their own while there was still time. South Carolina seceded on December 20th, 1860, becoming the first of the Southern states to leave the Union. By February 1861, the entire Deep South had joined them. That is to say, in addition to South Carolina, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. And they met in Montgomery, Alabama, and on February 8th, 1861, formally proclaimed the existence of a new nation, the Confederate States of America. No one in 1861 imagined or even could have possibly have imagined the bloodshed about to be unleashed, and which soon seemed out of all proportion to any rational aim. In 1864, a staunchly abolitionist Massachusetts senator, his name was Henry Wilson. 1864, Wilson briefly visited a battlefield in Virginia, where the Battle of the Wilderness had just been fought. And he saw carnage, not this carnage, but carnage like it. What we're looking at here are Confederate dead in a sunken road on the battlefield at Antietam, a battle fought in September 1862, the bloodiest single day in American military history. But Senator Wilson could have gone anywhere, Shiloh, Gettysburg, First or Second Manassas, Chickamauga, any place he went, he would have seen just carnage that would have beggared belief. And so he could well have said, after visiting any battlefield, what he said after coming back from the Battle of the Wilderness and seeing all the carnage there. He said, if that scene could have been presented to me before the war, anxious as I was for the preservation of the Union, I would have said, the cost is too great. Erring sisters, go in peace. Nowadays, we take the enormous casualties of the Civil War for granted. But the fact that Americans inflicted and absorbed such losses for 4 years is arguably the greatest single manifestation of the revolutionary nature of the conflict. After all, the regional differences between the North and South had been evident since the nation's founding. American statesmen had argued about the place of slavery in the United States as far back as the Continental Congress. Yet until 1860, Americans had always found a way to resolve the argument within the political system. The American tradition of compromise was one of its proudest and most successful traditions. What could have occurred to make it vanish so utterly during the Civil War years? Charles Royster, who I quoted earlier, the author of The Destructive War, Charlie Royster and others have concluded that the explanation stemmed from the extreme political rhetoric that flowed in torrents during the decades before the war. Americans, Charles Royster wrote, did not invent new methods of drastic war during the Civil War so much as they made real a version of the conflict that many of them had talked about from the start. Toxic political dialogue or ranting or whatever you want to call it. Absolutely deadly. Absolutely deadly. We still throw around just extreme characterizations of the parties and the peoples and so forth that we don't like. And we expect at the end of the day, it'll all turn out all right. That it won't have any effect on the country in which we live, on the American Republic, on the American democracy. Look back. Just a little bit over 150 years. Look back and see how wrong that assumption is. I'll say one more thing, and then let's go. There may be people, I could have been one of them at one time, who were listening to me and thinking, you talk about compromising slavery. How can you compromise with something, an evil thing like that? You almost sound like you're saying that they should have compromised, and that sounds really disturbing. Well, I'll tell you what. First of all, what was never on the table, never, was political, social, economic equality for African Americans. So there was never any negotiation about that. White Americans weren't interested in that at the time at all. So that's not an issue. The second thing is, if the American Civil War, all that carnage, 3% of the American population loss, if that had resulted in political, legal, social equality for African Americans and fair economic opportunity, then one might say, yes, the cost was worth it. The cost was not too great. But all of those lives, all of those 100,000 lives, all of those maimed bodies, the people who survived, all the grief of all the families left behind by these dead, all of that sacrifice got us exactly this: the Jim Crow South. It got us a segregationist South that lasted a whole century. That's what it got us. And reframed in those terms, the seeming moral turpitude of compromise comes in a different light. You look at that, just take a look at that photo. Just look at it, take a good look at it. Incidentally, that's one of the first photographs of American war dead ever taken. I'll tell you more about that perhaps some other time.